in LaFlora Hillenbrand's Unbroken to chapter 19, which is called 200 Silent Men. Chapter 19 starts on page 195, and at the end of chapter 18, you'll remember that basically their Japanese captors decided that they didn't need Louis and Phil anymore. They weren't going to get any information about U.S. intelligence or the planes, and so they're sending Phil and Louis to a prisoner of war camp, a POW camp, in Japan. And last that Louis thought, he thought this might be a good thing, like at least there would be some regulation, they shouldn't be tortured, maybe they'd have access to the Red Cross and some food and be able to write to his family. So that's Louis's hope as we start chapter 19. Here we go. Louis and Phil were sitting in a holding room on the Navy ship when the door slapped open and a crowd of agitated, sloppy drunk Japanese sailors pushed in. One of them asked if Japan would win the war. No, said Phil. A fist caught Phil in the face, then swung back and struck him again. Louis was asked who would win the war. America. The sailors fell onto the captives, fists flying. Something connected with Louis's nose, and he felt a crunch. An officer ran in, peeled the crewmen off, and ordered them out. Louis's nose was bleeding. When he touched it, he felt a gash and a bone elbowing out sideways. So his nose is broken. In choppy English, the officer told them that the crewmen had been rifling through the captives' wallets, which had been confiscated when they came on board. In Louis's wallet, they had found a folded, stained bit of newspaper. It was the cartoon that Louis had cut from the Honolulu Advertiser many months before, depicting his service in the raid on Wake. The officer said that about half of the ship's crew had been on Wake that night, and their ship, apparently anchored offshore, had been sunk. So these Japanese crew members are upset because they realized that Louis had maybe helped bomb their own friends where they had been stationed. The crewmen had regrets about attacking the captives. Later, the door opened again, and two of them lurched in, muttered apologies, draped their arms around Louis, and gave him sake, which is alcohol. Up here you can see a picture of the newspaper clipping that Louis had in his wallet. Louis and Phil were separated again, and Louis was locked in an officer's cabin. Every few days he had strange visits from a grinning sailor who would lean into the room, say, "Thump on the head for a biscuit," rap his knuckles on Louis's head, hand him a biscuit, and amble away. Between the sailors' visits, Louis had nothing to do but sit, pinching his fingers around his nose to set the bones, right? Because he wants them to heal, right? So he's trying to hold his broken bones in place. Bored, he rummaged through the cabin and found a bottle of sake. He began taking furtive or sneaky sips of the rice wine, little enough that its absence might not be missed. When, during a submarine alert, he panicked and drank so much that no one could fail to notice it, he decided he might as well finish it off. In the last days of the journey, the skinny American and the fat Japanese bottle had a grand time together. After a 3-week journey, including a stopover at Truk Atoll, the ship docked at Yokohama on the eastern coast of Japan's central island, Honshu. Louis was blindfolded and let out. Solid ground came underfoot. Through a gap in his blindfold, Louis's first glimpse of Japan was the word Chevrolet stamped on a hubcap. He was standing before a car. He heard someone stomping off the ship shouting. The men around Louis froze. The man approaching, he assumed, must be an officer. Louis felt the officer grabbing him and shoving him into the car's jump seat. As he struggled to get his legs in, the officer cracked him in the face with a flashlight. Louis felt his nose bones splay again. He thought of the sake and wondered if this man was its owner. He folded himself into the seat alongside Phil. The Chevy motored up through hilly country. After the better part of an hour, it stopped. Hands pulled Louis onto his feet and led him into an enclosed, humid space. The blindfold was untied. He was in a bathhouse, apparently in the promised POW camp. Phil was no longer with him. There was a tub before him filled with water that carried the tart smell of disinfectant. Told to undress and get in, he stepped into the water, luxuriating in the warmth, scrubbing himself clean for the first time since he'd left Oahu. When his bath was over, he was told to dress again. A man came in with clippers and shaved his head and beard. Louis was escorted out, led down a hallway, and stopped at a door. The guard told him to go in and wait for orders. Louis walked into the room. The lights were out, and he could only just make out the silhouette of a man in civilian clothing, facing away from him. Someone flipped on a light. The man turned, and Louis saw his face. It was his college friend, Jimmy Sasaki. Which, remember, Jimmy's kind of come up a few times throughout the book. Louis just thought he was a guy who was going to USC with him. We found out that Jimmy was actually a spy, and so now he's back in Japan and running into Louis. "We meet again," Sasaki said. Louis gaped at him in astonishment. He knew nothing of Sasaki's alleged spying and was stunned to see his friend in the service of the enemy. Sasaki looked at him warmly. He'd been prepared to see Louis, but he was disturbed by how thin he was. He made a playful crack about how ugly Louis looked bald. What followed was a strange and stilted conversation. Sasaki asked a few questions about Louis's odyssey, then began reminiscing, or remembering the past, about USC, meals at the student union, 10-cent movies on campus. Louis, uneasy, waited for questions on military matters, but they never came. The closest Sasaki got was to express confidence that Japan would win the war. He told Louis that he was a civilian employee of the Japanese Navy, which had made him head interrogator of all POWs in Japan. He said he bore a rank equal to that of admiral. Louis was taken outside. He was in a large compound with several one-story buildings surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. There was something spooky about this place. Louis, like every man brought there, noticed it immediately. Gathered in drifts against the buildings were some 200 whisper-thin captive Allied servicemen. Every one of them had his eyes fixed on the ground. They were as silent as snow. Now, this is a really disturbing picture, because if you have 200 captives and they're all just looking silent, they're looking at the ground, this is right away going to alert us as readers that something's wrong. This isn't what Louis expected. He was hoping he'd get some food, maybe contact his family, but this is clearly not a good situation. Louis was led to a bench some distance from the other captives. He saw Phil far away, sitting alone. A couple of captives sat on other benches across the compound, hiding their hands from the guard's view and gesturing to each other in Morse code, fists for dots and flat hands for dashes. Louis watched them until a captive approached. The man seemed to have permission to speak. He began to tell Louis about where he was. This wasn't a POW camp, which is where Louis thought he was going. It was a secret interrogation center called Ofuna, where high-value captured men were housed in solitary confinement or kept alone, starved, tormented, and tortured to divulge or to give or tell military secrets. Because Ofuna was kept secret from the outside world, the Japanese operated with an absolutely free hand. So remember, there are rules for what you can do to prisoners of war, and so Louis thought he'd be protected in a POW camp, but if this camp is secret, then they are not necessarily following those rules. The men in Ofuna, said the Japanese, weren't POWs. They were unarmed combatants at war against Japan, and as such didn't have the rights that the international law accorded POWs. So they're not saying they're prisoners, they're saying they're fighting. They just don't have weapons at the moment. In fact, they had no rights at all. If captives confessed their crimes against Japan, they'd be treated as well as regulations permit. Over the course of the war, some 1,000 Allied captives would be hauled into Ofuna, and many would be held there for years. The man told Louis the rules. He was forbidden to speak to anyone but the guards, to put his hands in his pockets, or to make eye contact with other captives. His eyes were to be directed downward at all times. He had to learn to count in Japanese, because every morning there was tenko, a roll call, an inspection in which men had to count off. To use the benjo, latrine, he had to ask in broken Japanese, "Benjo kudasai," and while bowing. He wouldn't be given a cup, so if he was thirsty, he had to beg the guard to escort him to the washstand. There were rules about every detail of life, from the folding of blankets to the buttoning of clothes, each reinforcing isolation and total obedience. The slightest violation would bring a beating. Now, a couple chapters ago, we talked about how dignity and feeling like you're a human is an essential part of your humanity and your will to live, and that as Louis started to lose his dignity, he also started to lose his will to live. Think about in upcoming chapters what isolation will do to people, and if while you're isolated, you're cut off from other humans, you don't have other human interactions or relationships, can you continue to want to stay alive? The Japanese were abundantly clear about one thing. In the secret place, they could and did do anything they wanted to their captives, and no one would ever know. They stressed that they did not guarantee that captives would survive Ofuna. They can kill you here, Louis was told. No one knows you're alive. After nightfall, Louis was taken into a barracks and led to a tiny cell. On the floor was a thin tatami, straw mat, which would be his bed with 3 paper sheets. There was a small window, but it had no glass, so wind eddied through the room. The walls were flimsy, the floorboards gapped, and the ceiling was tar paper. It was mid-September, and with winter approaching, Louis would be living in a building that was, in one captive's words, barely a windbreak. Louis curled up under the paper sheets. There were dozens of men in cells near him, but no one made a sound. Phil was in a cell far down the hall, and for the first time in months, Louis wasn't near him. In this warren of captive men, he was alone. Again, this idea of isolation is going to be really important in upcoming chapters. Each day began at 6, a bell clanging, a shouting guard, captives running outside to tenko. Louis would fall into a line of haggard men. Guards stalked them, clubs or baseball bats in their hands, and rifles with fixed bayonets over their shoulders, making menacing postures and yelling unintelligibly. The captives were hounded through a frenzied routine, counting off, bowing toward Emperor Hirohito, rushing to the washstand and benjo, and rushing back to the assembly area 5 minutes later. Then it was back to the barracks, where guards rifled through the men's things in search of contraband, or illegal items, misfolded blankets, misaligned buttons, anything to justify a beating. So they break any rules, they'll be beaten by guards. Breakfast came from captives who handed out bowls of watery, fetid slop, dirty, nasty slop, which each man ate alone in his cell. Then men were paired off, given cloths of wet rope, and forced to bend double, put the rope on the floor, and wash the 150-foot-long barracks aisle floor, the barrack aisle floor at a run, or sometimes waddling duck style, while the guards trotted behind them, swatting them. Then it was back outside, where the guards made the men run circles or perform calisthenics, like aerobic exercises, often until they collapsed, keeping in mind all they're eating is like nasty soup slop. A lot of them are already, like Louis, malnourished, really skinny, and then they're having to do all this physical activity on top of that. When the exercise was over, the men had to sit outside, regardless of the weather. The only breaks in the silence were the screams coming from the interrogation room. Punctuating the passage of each day were beatings. Men were beaten for folding their arms, for sitting naked to help heal sores, for cleaning their teeth, for talking in their sleep. Most often, they were beaten for not understanding orders, which were almost always issued in Japanese. Remember, there's still a language barrier for all of this. Dozens of men were lined up and clubbed in the knees for one man's alleged infraction. So if one person breaks a rule, everyone gets clubbed or beaten for that. A favorite punishment was to force men to stand, sometimes for hours, in the Ofuna crouch, a painful and strenuous position in which men stood with knees bent halfway and arms overhead. Those who fell over or dropped their arms were clubbed and kicked. Captives who tried to assist victims were attacked themselves, usually far more violently, so victims were on their own. Any attempt to protect oneself, ducking, shielding the face, provoked greater violence. My job, remembered Captive Glenn McConnell, was to keep my nose on my face and keep from being disassembled. He wants to just not get beaten to a point where his body comes apart. The beatings, he wrote, were of such intensity that many of us wondered if we'd ever live to see the end of the war. At night, in the cell again, Louis awaited dinner, eaten alone in the dark. Then he just sat there. He wasn't permitted to speak, whistle, sing, tap, read, or look out his window. There was another inspection outside, another haranguing, and then the uneasy pause of night. The pacing of the guards before the dawn again brought some shouting and running and the thud of clubs. At Ofuna, as the scores of POW camps scattered throughout Japan and its conquests, the men used for guard duty were the dregs of the Japanese military. Dregs meaning like the bottom of the barrel. So the people who are guards here are like the dropouts, the lowest in their class. You're not getting your top-notch people. Many had washed out or like failed out of regular soldierly life, too incompetent to perform basic duties. Quite a few were deranged, meaning like crazy, mentally incompetent, something like that. According to captives, there were two characteristics common to nearly all Ofuna guards. One was marked stupidity. The other was murderous sadism. We've heard this word sadism a couple of times before. It's going to come up a lot more. A person who's sadistic or who has sadism is taking pleasure in hurting someone else. And so they're saying that the guards here, they're going to be stupid and they're going to really enjoy hurting someone else, potentially to the point of murder. In the Japanese military of that era, corporal punishment, or like physical punishment, beating someone, hitting them, was routine practice. It was normal. Iron must be beaten while it's hot. Soldiers must be beaten while they're fresh, was a saying among servicemen. No strong soldiers, one another, are made without beatings. For all Japanese soldiers, especially low-ranking ones, beating was inescapable, often a daily event. It is thus unsurprising that camp guards, occupying the lowest station in a military and camp guards who were the lowest station in a military that applauded brutality, right? The military supports people being really brutal and harsh, would vent their frustrations on the helpless men under their authority. Japanese historians call this phenomenon transfer of oppression, meaning because these Japanese guards have had a bad time in society, they're going to transfer that onto the prisoners. This tendency was powerfully reinforced by two opinions common in Japanese society in that era. One held that Japanese were racially and morally superior to non-Japanese, a pure people divinely destined to rule. Just as Allied soldiers, like the cultures they came from, often held virulently racist views of the Japanese soldiers and civilians, intensely propagandized by their government, usually carried their own caustic or burning prejudices about their enemies, seeing them as brutish, subhuman beasts or fearsome Anglo-Saxon devils. So I just want to appreciate here that Laura Hillenbrand does a good job of saying, these people in the Japanese military are extremely racist against white Americans, but really against any other race that is non-Japanese. They think that Japanese are the best race and they should be in charge of everyone else. But Hillenbrand here points out that also this is just like the Allied soldiers. So same as the U.S. soldiers and everyone they're fighting with, the U.S. soldiers believe that Americans are the best, and more specifically, really, we're saying white Americans believe that they are the best. And there's tons of racism in the U.S. at this time. So this is a huge problem. It's horrible. But Hillenbrand does a good job of showing us that it's not just a one-sided thing. This racism and the hatred and fear it fomented surely served as an accelerant for abuse of Allied prisoners. So saying these prisoners will be treated worse because of how much racism there is from these Japanese prison guards. In Japan's militaristic society, all citizens from earliest childhood were relentlessly indoctrinated, or kind of like brainwashed, they're brought up with the idea, with the lesson that to be captured in war was intolerably shameful. In 1941, Japanese military field code made clear what was expected of those facing capture. Have regard for your family first. Rather than live and bear the shame of imprisonment, the soldier must die and avoid leaving a dishonorable name. As a result, in many hopeless battles, virtually every Japanese soldier fought to the death. For every Allied soldier killed, 4 were captured. For every 120 Japanese soldiers killed, 1 was captured. So they would rather die than be captured. And that means that they're not going to have a very high view of Americans who let themselves be captured, because in Japanese culture, this is really disgraceful to be captured. In some losing battles, Japanese soldiers committed suicide in mass, the whole group, to avoid capture. The few who were captured sometimes gave false names, believing that their families would rather think that their son had died. They'd rather die than be captured, and their family would rather have them dead than believe they're captured because they see that as so cowardly. The depth of the conviction was demonstrated at Australia's Cowra camp in 1944, when hundreds of Japanese POWs flung themselves at camp machine guns and set their living quarters afire in a mass suicide attempt that became known as the Night of 1,000 Suicides. The contempt and revulsion that most Japanese felt for those who surrendered or were captured extended to Allied servicemen. This thinking created an atmosphere in which to abuse, enslave, and even murder a captive or POW was considered acceptable, even desirable, because they think that these prisoners have done the very worst thing, which is be captured. And so if they mistreat them or even kill them, it's not as bad as letting yourself be captured. It's not as embarrassing or shameful. Some guards, intoxicated by absolute power, which means like you're drunk on your power, and indoctrinated or taught racism and disgust for POWs, these guards fell easily into sadism. So they easily began to take pleasure in hurting people. But those less inclined toward their culture's prejudices may still have been vulnerable to the call to brutality. Brutality means like really harsh, violent treatment. To be made responsible for imprisoning people is surely, to many guards, an unsettling experience, especially when they're tasked with depriving their prisoners of the most basic necessities. Oops, there we go. Perhaps some guards forced their prisoners to live in maximally dehumanizing conditions so that they could reassure themselves that they were merely giving loathsome beasts their due. Remember we talked about in earlier chapters the importance of treating other people like humans. And if you can start to dehumanize someone, so see your prisoners as a beast rather than a human, it's easier to mistreat them. Paradoxically then, some of the worst abuses inflicted on captives and POWs may have arisen from the guards' discomfort with being abusive. So they're uncomfortable with how badly they're treating these people, and that kind of continues the cycle. So then they'll treat them worse for making them feel uncomfortable. Writing of his childhood in slavery, Frederick Douglass, who we have read his narrative, told of being acquired by a man whose wife was a tender-hearted woman who had never owned a slave. Her face was made of heavenly smiles and her voice of tranquil music, Douglass wrote. She lavished him with motherly love, gave him lots of love, even giving him reading lessons, unheard of in slaveholding society. But after being ordered by her husband to treat the boy like the slave he was, she transformed into a vicious demon. She, like the Ofuna guards more than a century later, had succumbed to what Douglass called the fatal poison of irresistible power. So the idea being that when you're in power over someone and you start to treat them badly, that kind of kickstarts you on this path where you continue to treat this person as less than human. Of all the warped, pitiless men who persecuted captives at Ofuna, Suhara Kitamura stood above all others. In civilian life, by different accounts, he was either a sake salesman or a movie scenario writer. In Ofuna, he was a medical officer. Fascinated by suffering, he forced sick and injured captives to come to him for treatment, then tortured and mutilated them while quizzing them on their pain, his mouth curved in a moist smile. Known as the Butcher and the Quack, Kitamura was Ofuna's most eager instigator of beatings. He was a massive man, built like a bison, and he punched like a heavyweight. No official in Ofuna was more hated or feared. Though under great pressure to conform to a culture of brutality, a few guards refused to participate in the violence. In one incident, a captive was clubbed so savagely that he was certain he was going to be killed. In the middle of the assault, the attacking guard was called away, and a guard known as Hiroshi was ordered to finish the beating. Out of sight of the other guards, Hiroshi told the captive to cry out as if he were being struck, and pounded his club harmlessly against the floor. The two acted out their parts until it seemed enough beating had been done. The captive believed that Hiroshi may have saved his life. So there are some guards who are going to treat these captives like humans, right? This guy's going to just pretend to beat this prisoner so that he doesn't get in trouble with his superiors, but so the prisoner won't be beaten anymore. What Hiroshi did took nerve. Everywhere in Japan, demonstrating sympathy for captives or POWs was taboo. It was socially unacceptable. When a child living near the Zentsuji POW camp expressed compassion for the prisoners, her comments became a national scandal. Camp personnel caught trying to improve condition for POWs, or even voicing sympathy for them, were sometimes beaten by their superiors. The general opinion toward POWs at that time was very bad, wrote Yukichi Kano, a private at another camp who was beloved by POWs he tried to assist. There was always some risk to be misunderstood by Japanese by making humane interpretation of our duty. To resist against the wrong hostile feeling, prejudice, and lack of knowledge was not very easy for the lower rank soldier like me. At Ofuna, merciful guards paid the price. One officer, upon learning that another guard had shown leniency, or had been flexible, not as strict, to the captives, he assaulted the guard with a sword. During his nightly walk from the kitchen job to his cell, one captive would regularly see a guard who refused to beat prisoners being singled out for gang attacks from his fellow guards. So this is all really important because Lori Hillenbrand wants us to understand that this is a cultural problem that's going on. So she's trying to give us some background on what's going on in Japan, what's going on with the higher up officers that's leading to these guards being treated, the guards treating the POWs so poorly. At Ofuna, captives weren't just beaten, they were starved. The thrice daily meals usually consisted of a bowl of broth with a bit of vegetable and a bowl or half bowl of rancid rice, bad rice, sometimes mixed with barley. It contained virtually no protein and was grossly lacking in nutritive value and calories. It was camp policy to give diminished and or spoiled rations to captives suspected of withholding information, and at times the entire camp's rations were cut to punish one captive's reticence. So if they think anyone has not been totally truthful or told them everything they could tell about the US or the Allied military, everyone would get less food. The food was infested with rat droppings, maggots, and so much sand and grit that Louis's teeth were soon pitted, chipped, and cracked because you're eating that dirt. It's going to chip away at your teeth. The men nicknamed the rations al dumpo. The extremely low caloric intake and befouled food, coupled with the exertion of a forced exercise, put the men's lives in great danger. We were dying, wrote Captain Jean Balch, on about 500 calories a day. Scurvy was common, which is a disease you get when you have no vitamins, so no fruits and vegetables. You typically get scurvy. Usually we talk about sailors getting scurvy. Foodborne parasites and pathogens made diarrhea almost ubiquitous. Everyone had diarrhea. Most feared was beriberi, a potentially deadly disease caused by a lack of thiamine. There were two forms of beriberi, and they could occur concurrently at the same time. Wet beriberi affected the heart and the circulatory system, causing marked edema, I have to look that one up, swelling of the extremities. If untreated, it was often fatal. Dry beriberi affected the nervous system, causing numbness, confusion, unsteady gait, or walking crooked, and paralysis. When wet beriberi victims pressed on their swollen limbs, deep indentations would remain long after the pressure was removed, giving the men the unnerving impression that their bones were softening. In some cases, wet beriberi caused extreme swelling of the scrotum. Some men's testicles swelled to the size of bread loaves. In Ofuna's theater of cruelty, survival was an open question, and deaths were common. For Louis, Phil, and the other captives, the only hope lay in the Allies rescuing them, but this prospect also carried tremendous danger. In the fall of 1942, when the Americans attacked Japanese ships off Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, the Japanese beheaded 22 POWs held on the island. So if there's hope that the Americans will get rescued, the Japanese will kill their prisoners of war. A similar horror played out on Japanese-held Balali in the Shortland Islands, where British POWs were being used as slaves to build an airfield. According to a Japanese officer, in the spring of 1943, when it appeared that the Americans were soon to land on Balali, Japanese authorities issued a directive that in the event of an invasion, the POWs were to be killed. No landing occurred, but in response to an Allied bombing, the Japanese executed all of the POWs anyway, some 70 to 100 men. So these men couldn't have even been freed, but they still were executed, which again goes to show that the Japanese just see it as such a shameful thing to be captured, that they treat these captives horribly. A few weeks after Louis arrived at Ofuna, an American carrier force began bombing and shelling Wake Atoll, where the Americans captured during the Japanese invasion were still being held as slaves. Mistakenly believing that an invasion was imminent, the Japanese commander had the prisoners blindfolded, bound, shot, and dumped in a hole. One man escaped. When he was caught 3 weeks later, the commander himself beheaded him. The only trace of the men was found years afterward. In the atoll lagoon, on a hunk of coral, one of the POWs had scraped a message. 98 US PW 51043. Meaning that all of these 98 people, prisoners of war, were killed on this date. These murders were the first applications of what would come to be known as the kill-all rule. Japanese policy held that the camp commanders could not, under any circumstances, allow Allied forces to recapture POWs. If Allied advances made this a possibility, POWs were to be executed. If there's any fear that POWs would be retaken due to the tide of battle turning against us, read a May 1944 order issued to every POW branch camp commander. Decisive measures must be taken without returning a single POW. So this means that Louis' chance of being rescued is really, really low, because if the U.S. gets close enough to rescue people, or the Allied forces, which is Team America basically, I shouldn't say that. It's the countries that the U.S. was allied or teamed up with. Anyway, if the Allied forces get close enough to rescue Louis, the prisoners of war will be killed. Also think about what this means for the treatment of prisoners of war. It means that you basically will be enslaved. You'll try and do hard labor until you are not useful anymore, and then they'll kill you because they're not trying to keep you alive to get back to your home. That August, the Japanese War Ministry would issue a clarification of this order, sending it to all POW camp commanders. At such time as the situation becomes urgent and it be extremely important, the POWs will be concentrated and confined in their present location, and under heavy guard, the preparation for the final disposition will be made. Whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates. So basically, we don't care how you do it, just make sure these people do not live. In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate or destroy them all, and not to leave any traces. As the Allies fought their way toward Japan, the captives in Ofuna and POWs everywhere else faced the very real threat that Allied success would bring the kill-all policy to bear on them. While none of the captives knew of the incidents in which this order had already been followed, the guards at Ofuna enjoyed warning them about the policy. Like every other captive, Louis knew that most of the guards would be eager to carry it out. On that grim note, we'll pause for the next chapter.